Welcome to Global Tax Talk. I'm Sindhu Blume. We're witnessing significant shifts in global tax policy resulting from a G7 meeting with notable outcomes, uncertainty around tariff and trade discussions, and the enactment of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. So how does all of this affect a company's strategic planning for the future? Joining me to answer that question are Will Morris, PwC's Global Tax Policy Leader, and Pat Brown, PwC's National Tax Office Co-Leader. Gentlemen, welcome.
Good to be here.
So I have a number of questions for you, but before we get to the details, I'd like to get a sense from you about this question of thinking about the future and a company's strategic plan. So based on all of these things that are happening right now, what is your, if you, just very briefly, if you could tell me, what does that look like? Well, let's start with you.
In one word.
You know, if you could do that, that would be great.
Wouldn't it? But I can't, of course. A constitution incapable of doing that. Look, the situation gets only more complex. And as you said, more fluid. And I think that the most important thing that businesses can do is to be well informed. Both Pat and I, as you know, worked at a large business before we came to PwC. And the first thing our boss told us was, there is only one cardinal mistake that you can make, and that is delivering a surprise to senior management. They said they can take almost any amount of bad news for which they've been prepared, but a surprise is a disaster. So I think in this context, you can't make predictions as to what's going to happen, but you can talk about what possible outcomes might be, what the inputs are, all of the things which are swirling around. And so keep senior management apprised. Keep on top of this stuff. Don't worry if you don't know where it's going. Nobody knows where it's going. But keep on top of the information flow, essentially.
All right, Pat?
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Will said, and kind of very consistent with that. I would say it is a very understandable impulse if you're sitting within a company today to sort of want to take a big kind of sigh. Wow, okay, this crazy process of working through this bill, 899, is it in, is it not in, what's going to happen with the U.S. international tax provisions. We've landed that, and we've landed it in a way that provides, at least on the surface, with respect to the U.S. provisions, a great deal more certainty. We don't have a lot of sunsets and things like that built into the U.S. international tax rules. So, hey, can I just take a moment? I would say, yeah, take a moment. But then, to Will's point, you absolutely have to stay engaged in this. This G7 statement that we're going to talk about, it's going to have to get notched down several levels of detail to become actionable. At any step along the way, there are opportunities for it to go sideways from the perspective of one company or many companies. And so paying attention to that process and frankly providing engagement into the U.S. Treasury Department if you're a U.S. company, or your equivalent if you're operating outside the United States, so that they understand how this is going to actually land when you get down to the level below a political leader's statement, down to something that's actually actionable and finds its way into laws. Hey, I know what they said at the G7, but this language that's showing up in a document or potentially in our laws, it's going to create problems that you maybe not thinking about. So I couldn't agree more with Will on this point about engagement. Engagement, following along what's happening, and being prepared to intervene essentially with governments to say, you need to make sure that what actually comes out of this process lines up with what expectations we're going in.
All right, thank you both for starting with that. And Pat, let me stay with you and talk about the One Big Beautiful Bill. Now, there was a great interest from inbounds in Section 899, which we've talked about extensively. And after the G7 deal, it was taken out.
Right.
What now is of interest to inbounds? What provisions are there that they are really focused on? Yeah,
so I think broadly speaking, Sindhu, the bill overall is good news for companies for a lot of reasons, and was really what I highlighted in my prior response, which is we're no longer dealing with a system that has built into it so many sunsets, phase outs, caps, eliminations, things like that, right? The international provisions that were adopted originally in the TCJA are now, I hesitate to use the word permanent because nothing's permanent in the tax law, we all know that. But they're not subject to these kind of built-in caps and phase-outs and things like that. That is very good news, because if you're a company tax director who has to advise management about what is the likely return on a potential investment in the United States over the next 10 years. Well, at least now you can say, based on current law, here's what that looks like, right? Because current law includes a beat rate of 10.5%, a GILTI rate of between 12.6 and 14%, an FDII rate of 14%. Things that you can then build into a model without having to add a bunch of asterisks saying it's not really clear where this is going to go. So there was a lot of focus and attention as well. And for some companies, this was, I think, going to be seen as like a miss, that the potential changes to the BEAT that were originally included in the version of Senate text that Senator Crapo released. So these were changes that would raise the BEAT rate to 14%, lower the threshold from 3% to 2%, but would add a high tax exception. For a number of inbound companies, that high tax exception was really good news. That fell away in the final bill, so that's not good news.
Right.
But in the end, what we ended up with was, which is a BEAT that it looks basically identical to current law BEAT. Instead of being at a 10% rate, it's at a 10.5% rate. I would say, broadly speaking, that's a win because we've got that locked in. We've got some certainty now as to how that's going to apply going forward. The last thing I would say, Sindhu, is there's clearly an attempt on the part of Congress in this bill to make the United States a more attractive place to invest, right? So permanent expensing, 4-year or 5-year expensing for structures added to the permanent expensing provision. So there are things in here that are intended very much on the part of Congress and the administration to say, come on in, we want more investment here in the United States. So companies really should be, inbound companies should be looking at that now and making those assessments and making those modeling decisions about how to think about how this changes the landscape.
All right, and Will, let me come to you now.
Yep.
And let's talk about that G7 deal.
Yep.
So the United States got what it wanted. And what does that mean then for countries that have legislated Pillar 2 and timing?
Right. So in my hands, I have a piece of paper, the G7 statement. I mean, did the US get what it wanted? Obviously, it did at some level. There is this is an understanding. This is an agreement to agree, just to be very clear about that. Pat has already said that. And there are 4 points of the understanding which are listed in the document. The first has crystal clarity. It says a side-by-side system. The understanding would include a side-by-side system which would fully exclude US parented groups from the UTPR and the IIR in respect of both their domestic and foreign profits. There is absolutely no doubt about what that means. Maybe. Because there are then a couple of other points. The next point in particular is quite crucial. It says a side-by-side system would include a commitment to ensure any substantial risks that may be identified with respect to the level playing field or risks of base erosion and profit shifting are addressed to preserve the common policy objectives of the side-by-side system. That sounds like an invitation to anti-abuse rules. Once you start getting into anti-abuse rules, then the clarity of the first statement perhaps gets lost slightly. And then there are other things as well, material simplifications under Pillar 2, that will take time. Everything that the OECD has done so far has added material complexity to this rather than anything else. And also, this thing about considering changes to Pillar 2 in relation to substance-based non-refundable tax credits, which has been, the big issue.
Sure.
But again, we know that that's a bone of contention for some of the countries out there. Okay. So the US got that first statement, and that obviously is very useful. That is a really important starting point. That was what the 2 chairmen of the Congressional Tax Writing Committees fixed on. Also, as we said, 899 is gone, but could be back. They did say that. So, as the negotiations move forward, this is the right starting point. But there is a lot of complexity that these other points can bring in. Other things to mention, this is the G7. One of those is the US, so it's only 6 other countries, important ones to be sure. They have problems changing their own laws. Can they carry the rest of the world when the rest of the world has looked at this OECD process over the past several years, both BEPS 1.0 and 2.0, and said, hey, the G7 has done this to their own advantage? So again, there's nothing which necessarily follows particularly quickly from that. And one of the issues is how quickly does the Congress wish this to be resolved? As we've talked in other contexts, there is the possibility of 2 more reconciliation bills before the end of next year, the end of 2026, calendar 2026. Would you want 899 in one of those? What if this takes a substantial amount of time to work out? So it's clearly a great start, and it is a very good start for the US Treasury to have this statement in there. But exactly how it works out, we don't know. And obviously there are other bits in here to actually answer part of your question, which would be good for other countries' businesses as well, that material simplification. But again, how realistic is that in context?
All right, so I said in my open about issues creating shifts, and I think the next topic we're going to talk about is probably one of the biggest shifts that we've had this year, and that's trade and tariffs. And Pat, I want to come to you about that because at the end of June, Canada withdrew its DST.
Right.
And it was done because President Trump called it a blatant attack
Right.
and promised to impose tariffs
Right.
on Canadian imports. So that was pulled back. So what does this mean for future negotiations?
Yeah, it's a great question, Sindhu. And I would say, taking a step back, in an era where there is precious little bipartisanship in Washington, D.C., one of the few areas where there has been just, enormous bipartisan accord has been hatred on the part of the U.S. Congress on both parties of DSTs. Just, these are clearly discriminatory taxes. They're clearly protectionist in nature. They are essentially a form of trade barrier that's focused only on U.S. companies or almost entirely on U.S. companies. But as I just indicated, and as your question indicates, they sort of fall more into the trade context quite naturally than they do into the income tax world. They're not an income tax. They are a form of taxation, sort of, that is essentially a cloaked form of trade protectionism. And so it's not surprising that in the Trump administration, frankly, even all the way back to the Obama administration, but the Obama administration, the Trump administration, the Biden administration, now the Trump administration again, it's really been through the trade lens, USTR, that the U.S. has been pounding away primarily at DSTs. 899 threw a little bit of a wrench into that by essentially looking at DSTs as a taxation measure akin to the Pillar 2 UTPR. Like, these are bad forms of tax, and we're going to use our income tax system to go after them. Unlike, however, the Pillar 2 UTPR, which, as Will was just describing, there's a multilateral process kicked off by the G7 now that will find its way to the inclusive framework. The multilateral equivalent attempt on DSTs was, of course, Pillar 1, which is essentially fading away into obscurity because it's just simply not going to ever get done. That only really leaves a bilateral process for DSTs, right? So I think it was a great start for that bilateral process to see Canada essentially agree to withdraw its DST. Now, Canada, in some respects, uniquely dependent on the United States economy, really in a very weak position to essentially say, we're going to keep our DST without regard to what the United States says. Will other countries be as willing to essentially agree to dial back or eliminate their DSTs because of trade pressure from USTR? Well, it hasn't happened yet, and it hasn't happened despite the fact that we have been, with a greater or lesser degree of emphasis, focused on DSTs, again, going back several administrations now. So I think this is a really positive sign for the companies who are concerned about DSTs, a very positive sign from the members of Congress who have been pounding and pounding and pounding away that DSTs need to go. But there's a long road ahead of us with respect to kind of trying to, get rid of DSTs more broadly, because it's going to be hand-to-hand combat, bilateral discussions, country by country, where a lot of other issues are on the table. So how's that going to play out? Well, we'll have to wait and see.
Okay. And staying with trade, will the process for negotiations is shifting a little bit? We're seeing President Trump issuing letters to not all the countries he wants to do it, send the letter to with new tariff rates. They are higher, and an executive order that was signed shifting a July 9th end date for imposing tariffs to August 1st.
Right.
So what does this whole new process mean? If you could talk us through that.
Yep. And
what questions, I'm curious, are you getting from companies about this?
Let me just come back one point on the DSTs, which I think is important, is that I agree with Pat. Obviously, there are other DSTs out there, and they have not yet been withdrawn in the way that Canada's has. I think, however, what this process may do is freeze major new DSTs, and that itself is an important.
That's a great point.
Right.
An important achievement, I think. Okay, so on trade, I mean, GTT viewers have heard me say many times, and indeed as of you, that the past 6 months have actually been very different from anything that went before. For the first time, tax is not driving the bus. Trade is driving the bus, and that continues to be true. I mean, 2 days, 3 days after the president signs, this piece of legislation, we're back with tariffs again. And so, we have this process which continues to be bilateral. As of the moment of filming, 21 of these letters have been issued. Obviously, there were many more on the original list in early April. And we'll hear more about those as we go by. One letter we know has not been sent out is one to the EU. And obviously, that is a very big one here. It's also a big one because it relates back to the G7 and exactly how this deal will be worked out. And this is something which could be knocked off course by tariffs. So, so far we've had a relatively small number of agreements announced. We've had the one with the UK. I mean, and these are partial, just to be clear. One's with the UK, one's with China, one with Vietnam. And one of the interesting points about the Vietnam one is the question of how it relates back to China, because a lot of the focus in the Vietnam one is on transshipments, which is to say goods being routed through Vietnam from China to try and change the US tariff result. So there's going to be a lot of US focus on that. So, I would continue to expect this to shift, at least for the moment. Obviously the government is not going to use, the administration is not going to use exactly the same tariff mechanism that they used back in April. They'll use slightly different ways, and various different types of investigations have already been announced as well. But I would expect to see this, sort of continuing to play out bilaterally. August the 1st is currently the date. Is anything completely set in stone? Not necessarily. And by the way, somebody ought to also mention that in not every country in the world is August the 1st a date when there are huge numbers of government officials paying attention to stuff. So I would expect to continue to see this play out. So in terms again of what the questions that I've been getting, which is what does this mean for tax? What does it mean for the G7 stuff? And how do we think about tariffs in context? Again, I'll go back to what I said right at the very beginning when you asked your bonus question, if one can have a bonus question right at the beginning, which is, what should companies be doing? And the answer is paying very close attention to this, collecting their data, modeling out what the effects would be, but again, not making dramatic changes in their structures for the moment, because this transshipment stuff, for example, the one that I talked about in relation to Vietnam, there are no details around that. We don't really know what it means. Right. We don't know what the categories would be, what some important definitions are. So making big moves based on that seems to me to be a little premature at the moment. Okay. My guess, for what it's worth, is that sometime in the fall, in the autumn of this year, we'll have, in the same way that we now know more about what the tax position is in the US, we will know more about what a sort of more stable tariff situation looks like. To be sure, it's going to be higher than it was, right. Prior to January the 20th. But equally, there should be a little more certainty about it. So, but equally, things could go off track. We know that. We've seen that before. And particularly if something untoward happens in relation to the EU, then a lot of other things which we're making assumptions about in the tax space, and our clients are, businesses are, will have a different outcome. So again, it's a very fluid situation. Watch, wait, prepare, but don't necessarily jump.
So uncertainty is the trend currently.
It is everything.
And I think, Pat, you said at the beginning something about taking a minute or taking a breath.
Right.
It might vary. The length of that breath might vary, yes, depending on your situation.
You have to breathe, though, just to be clear.
Yes, breathing is important.
Right.
Gentlemen, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate this.
Yes.
And thank you also for joining us. And come back soon next time on Global Tax Talk so that you are global tax ready. Take care.